Welcome to Joining the Dots. I'm Thomas Strohan, your host. This podcast explores real-life insights from those dedicated to pursuing justice, reducing harm, and enhancing global security. As co-founder of Clue Software and a technologist, I collaborate daily with diverse teams tackling some of the most pervasive problems in the world, ranging from child abuse to human trafficking, organised crime, fraud, and much more. In Joining the Dots, I speak with those deeply entrenched in these worlds. The victims, the perpetrators, the investigators, the leaders, the techies, the academics. The often unsung heroes on the front line, working to tirelessly create a safer world. Welcome to Joining the Dots. Today, we are delighted to be joined by Peter Spindler. Peter has run some of the country's most high-profile and challenging investigations that have had a profound impact on our society, the impact of which we still talk about today. And indeed, we will talk about today. Today, Peter has a number of roles linked to chairing, advising and assisting the not-for-profit and faith sectors around safeguarding. He also runs his own consultancy, which gives strategic advice around safeguarding and policing. Earlier in his career, Peter spent a number of years at the Regional and National Crime Squad, now known as the National Crime Agency, before a period of time in senior positions at the Metropolitan Police, among others. Of particular note, and what will likely be a main topic of conversation today, Peter led Operation Yewtree, which was, of course, the police investigation into sexual abuse allegations against Jimmy Savile predominantly, but also Rolf Harris, Max Clifford, the list goes on. Now, we're 10 years plus on from that, and there is so much to discuss in that area. So, first of all, welcome, Peter.
Welcome. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for that flattering introduction.
Very welcome, very welcome. I'm sure we'll go into more of it, but delighted to have you here. So just to orientate you and also our listeners, we have a reasonably consistent format that we follow for these interviews. Firstly, we kick off with the same question, which explores why you chose the path you chose. Secondly, we go into the main part of the conversation, which, as we've alluded to, we will likely be orientated around Yewtree and a few other things. And then lastly, we ask you to transport yourself to 2030 and give us some crystal ball predictions and insights into where the world is going in your domain. So if you're okay with that, we'll kick off.
Definitely.
Okay, so the pivotal moment that ultimately led you to your chosen path, and then also importantly, the moment that led you to understand the impact that technology would have on that journey.
It's a question that I get asked on many occasions, partly because both my parents were doctors. And so I've been brought up in a family of public servants, working for the public good. However, at the age of 13, when you make, or in those days were the O-level choices, and you're no good at physics, chemistry and biology, and you're heading in a different direction, you're not going to become a doctor. You know, those sorts of career decisions are made at such a young age. What I was, however, fascinated with was policing as a subject, and I can actually take back that interest to primary school when at the age of 7 there was a visit from the local, what would have been called home beat in those days, in today's language sort of neighbourhood officer, and the impact that he had on us as a class, his personality, his view of life, and I thought that's what I want to be like. Now, of course, you wind forward another decade to when you're 18, going off to university. At that point, I decided that was a career I wanted to try. So went to Warwick University, studied politics, and then within that, did everything I could to ensure that I would get into policing. Ended up leading what was called the Community Volunteers, worked in a secure unit of a psychiatric hospital just outside of Coventry, ended up leading and managing 500 plus student volunteers. What I hadn't quite realised was when I applied for the Met and I was aware of a graduate entry scheme, didn't really understand the significance of the scheme. It was Home Office led then, but I was a graduate, thought, well, I better apply for that scheme, go for what was called extended interview, 3 days of sort of tests and analysis, and start talking about what I've been doing. all of that was sort of taken into consideration and ended up putting me on a fast track scheme. We called it accelerated promotion in those days. And I've actually got a PowerPoint presentation where I sort of set it out how I got to the sort of chief officer rank that I did, but I titled it Self-Fulfilling Prophecy. It's almost like you were pre-programmed that you will end up at the top of the organisation. You do all the right things, take all the right opportunities. However, once I was in the organisation, I soon realised that it was the CID that interested me the most. So the detective
CID
work,
being
the Criminal Investigation Department, so Scotland Yard detective, a brand that is still phenomenal around the world, and despite all the disparaging remarks around modern day policing both in the UK and abroad, the reality is the Scotland Yard detective is something that everybody aspires to be like.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. So when we speak internationally, Clue, it rides on the coattails to a certain extent of British policing. We are well regarded, and Scotland Yard being a great example of that.
And the sorts of cases that you highlighted earlier are the sorts of things that the Yard will take on. It will always take on the too difficult. People from around the world will come to it for its expertise. Yes, policing makes mistakes. Yes, policing is imperfect, but actually it's very good at learning the lessons. It spends a lot of time debriefing and actually uses technology very effectively. There's a program called Hydra, which was developed to use technology as part of a debriefing process, but also for exercising and training around critical incidents. And the critical incidents are something that actually we've usually got wrong, but not necessarily caused by the police, but it's if the police or any organisation's response is not perfect and undermines the trust and confidence of the people and their communities, then you would declare it as a critical incident. And it's those sorts of things that policing takes very seriously.
Yeah. Well, we'll come on to a bit of that, I guess, with sort of retrospective of Savile and various things like that. But yeah, continue. You were sort of you talked about when this sort of lifelong. I mean, this is the first conversation I've had where it's been from that age, from that primary school age right up, that you've just you've known your outlook. But talk me through the moments around technology where you sort of thought, okay, this is going to play quite a big bit of what I'm doing.
I joined policing in 1985. Now, many of your viewers and listeners won't even have been born then, but you have to go back to a time when we didn't have a laptop. There weren't computers on the desk. There weren't smartphones. And it was a more traditional way of policing. The intelligence that was held was on a collator's index. So what would be now an intelligence officer. But these were card indexes in big rooms, bigger than this, a whole wall of trays, and you would pull out and you would search for a name. We used microfiches to access people's criminal records. So if you were putting a case file together, it was laborious typing, and I remember putting carbonated papers in the wrong way round and having to retype it. It was a very different time, and that first sort of decade almost of policing was really reliant on talking to people, engaging with people. Yes, you had a personal radio, and yes, there were access to some limited national databases, but the technology didn't really arrive until the 90s. We didn't digitize our intelligence system, I think, until 96. It's actually not that long ago. And I didn't really understand the importance of technology to policing until I went on to the National Crime Squad. And I was a detective chief inspector, a branch commander, and one of my teams was working on what was called Operation Cathedral. And it was a case that had been developed by Sussex Police, brought to the National Crime Squad because it was a transnational inquiry into paedophile activity on the internet. And this was in the early days of the internet. But Sussex Police had identified something called the Wonderland Club, a group of paedophiles who were trading images, abusing children, operating across multiple countries. This actually led to the world's largest ever, and I don't think has ever been followed, coordinated set of arrests where 12 countries around the world acted all at the same time to arrest over 200 people because they were so scared of the information being deleted and the evidence being wiped away. Whilst I wasn't responsible for that in the late 90s, I inherited the after effects, if you like, in 2000 and had to support the team. I'd been promoted to detective superintendent and support the team taking the case through the Crown Courts, certainly the UK end of it. But the most important part was to try and identify the children who'd been subject to the abuse. And we had albums of images created to share around the world with our colleagues in law enforcement from the 750,000 images that have been seized. Now, I'm talking 24 years ago now, but in the time that's passed, it's not a significant time. The amount of images available now are in the multi-millions, and with AI technology on the horizon, creating and generating more images, that task of trying to identify the victims of abuse and prevent any further abuse is made even more difficult. We'll probably come back to that later.
Yeah. So that was sort of this point where you were right. Okay, yeah, this is where technology is going to have to really play quite a big part. I think one of the reflections that I consistently pick up with conversations is that yes, there, you know, in the 80s or 90s we had indexes and we had physical sort of, you know, we had to go into rooms like this and look for intelligence on, you know, written forms and things. And then the contrast, we say, oh yes, but nowadays we have intelligence databases and that link all these things and do it automatically. But the consistency is you still need good people to operate it. You know, like you still need someone who understands the analysts. You need people who understand intelligence. You need people who have an insight and understanding of criminal activity to actually give you quality information. Your data still needs to be of good quality, and those same principles still apply. And
you're actually following exactly the same investigative techniques, but hopefully by digitising those business processes, you've made them more efficient and effective. But of course, what's happening in parallel to that, far more information is being generated. You move into a digital age where you've got cell phones, computers, other electronic devices, massive amount of storage and data, so digital forensics now is incredibly complicated. But add to that automatic number plate reader for tracking people's vehicles, all the sort of cell site analysis you can do around the phones, closed circuit television. There's a whole set of other digital things that now need to be put in. So you build up these sort of layers of information. I mean, the Hatton Garden diamond heist in 2015, which I also oversaw, it was my final big case, is a great example of how analog criminals were caught in the digital age by the digital detective, essentially. But it's the analytical work that is so important to try and make sense of all of this digital information that's being provided.
Yeah. So your Operation Cathedral is this sort of this operation in the late 90s, which was one of the first probably major child abuse digital investigations. Then further in your career, the Jimmy Savile situation happened, which is less digital and more traditional, traditionally perpetrated, I suppose. But perhaps we could just move into this discussion now, and perhaps you could take us back to then and talk through how it came about and how it landed on your desk and how you ran that. Because most people listening will remember quite vividly that period of time. 2012, October. Talk us through from a sort of first line perspective.
Just before I do that, what I want to say about Operation Cathedral, it was a wake-up call, not just for governments. I mean, I actually attended a G8 conference of interior ministers with British government representative to talk to other nations about what we had done and how we'd done it. But it was a wake-up call for me. I'd come from a world of proactivity, I was fighting serious and organised crime. But once you're exposed to what people are doing to the most vulnerable in society, and you see this in so many people in the safeguarding world, that once you see the depravity and of the abuse and the age of those that are involved, you get bitten by the sort of passion bug. You feel you've got to do something about this. And I went back to the Met as Detective Superintendent into the Child Abuse Investigation Command, which had been formed not long after the death of, or the murder of, Victoria Columbier, where we pulled together all the resources centrally. And within that, we had two major investigation teams. They were using the Home Office linked major inquiry scheme, and we started to investigate the murders of children and other complex abuse inquiries. And I was in that command for 3 years, became the Detective Chief Superintendent. So I was well established in that world. I had a good understanding of child abuse investigations, of victim focused inquiries, and this is a bit of different to way some other types of policing focus, where they may all be very offender focused, targeting core nominals and things. I left that world for a few years on promotion. And in 2012, I come back as a commander, head of major investigations for the Specialist Crime Directorate at Scotland Yard, and I had murder, rape and child abuse in my portfolio. 3 commands, each headed by a Detective Chief Superintendent. Now, I thought, actually, child abuse investigations, I know that world, I've come from that world, my focus will be on probably the rape inquiries. Murder, very well structured, very professional response, didn't need a lot of my attention. The world of rape investigation is much more challenging and remains so today. I became aware in the media of this story around Savile. So Savile had died at the end of 2011. There has always been information in the background, in and around the media, about his behaviour. He's a very odd character. But
and what were your reflections then, even before these things had happened and before that we started, what we'll get onto? But did you, with your background, with your understanding of criminals and paedophiles, were you just like, this just doesn't?
Savile always came across as a slightly creepy individual. He was not one of my heroes. He was one of the nation's heroes. He was the brand. He actually fronted a sort of child safety prevention campaigns. He had his own television series, Jim will fix it. So Jimmy Savile, but Jim will fix it. He was knighted by the Queen. He also had the equivalent of a papal knighthood. He was networked with prime ministers through the royal family. He had all sorts of positions in society that you would never normally expect a celebrity to occupy. However, as a police officer, you're working on information being provided by the public, reports of crime, and if there isn't anything in the system, then you've got no reason to take action. But as I say, it's one of those cases that when the story broke, and it was actually our independent television network, ITV, who put the story through a programme in October 2012 about allegations of Savile and others, because it wasn't just him, abusing vulnerable young women at a school in Surrey. And there had been an initial investigation in 2009 by Surrey and Sussex Police. I wasn't aware of that. However, as ever with the media and celebrities, ITV start to trailer the story before they broadcast. So it's already a lead news story. Now, one of the challenges in the British policing structure is in England and Wales, we have 43 separate police forces. We have then the Police Service of Scotland and the Police Service of Northern Ireland. And there are a couple of other defence-type policing agencies. There is no one coordinating body for any of these. They all act independently. Go back probably 4 or 5 years, no, maybe longer than that actually, probably to the early 2000s. After the murder of Holly and Jessica in Soham in Cambridgeshire, we had recognised that intelligence and information wasn't being shared across police forces, and a system was developed called the Impact Nominal Index after a big public inquiry by Lord Bishard that pulled together and did a sort of dump of data into a system that we now call the Police National Database. So actually it allowed the fragmented intelligence system to be searched in a better way.
Yeah.
It didn't work in the Savile case, interestingly enough, and I hadn't understood the complexities of how the Police National Database is structured. And if you don't get the spelling or the dates of birth exactly right, you won't necessarily get a hit on information that's in the system. And I'd actually asked my staff as the story was breaking, search our systems in the Met. Have we got anything on Savile? The answer I got was no. What was happening at a national level, what the forerunner of the National Crime Agency was actually called the Serious and Organised Crime Agency. They had a department that is called the Child Exploitation and Online Protection Centre, primarily dealing with internet crime, travelling sex offenders, but trying to operate really as a clearinghouse for information for the 43 forces. They had set up a coordinating centre around the Savile case. They'd recognised that this is a big news story. There may well be some more reports coming forward. Yep. They made probably the best decision that they could was to involve one of our big children's charities, the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, NSPCC, and had them working alongside them. Because it was a non-recent case, and I won't use the word historic because it's never historic for the victims, but they didn't have any expertise in that. So they asked the Met, and I provided a detective inspector and an analyst to support them with the investigation. Once the TV series or TV programme had been broadcast, many more people started to come forward to them, reporting through the NSPCC using their helpline. And we soon realised that actually there were offences in London. Surrey and Sussex had already had one try at this case, 2009, and I could see that there was likelihood going to be criticism of that, as ever, when the hindsight police turn up and they start reviewing how things have been investigated in the past. You'll always find it's never good enough. So we decided we built this capability within the Child Abuse Investigation Command, and it was about the abuse of children. It wasn't adult rape as such, although there were plenty of examples of that. But what we did, we put the investigation with one of our major investigation teams. We use the Home Office Link Major Inquiry System, which is a database designed to process large volumes of information. And we went forward to tell the public that we were going to take this seriously, they were going to be listened to, and that we will take action. And it was like we'd empowered victims to come forward.
I remember that. I remember within the context of that time, just more and more victims, survivors coming forward. And I suppose in the background there, you were in this context of, well, we've got nothing on the system, to all of a sudden lots of reports coming in, but then all of a sudden, I suppose, all these other forces going, well, actually, we've got stuff as well. So you're kind of gathering information from the public whilst simultaneously gathering information from policing systems, plural. Is that?
Well, one of the key things with safeguarding is that you need to open as many pathways as possible for people to report. We kept the NSPCC with us. Now, a lot of the survivors of the abuse of celebrities and other people in powerful positions will have had bad experiences of trying to report first off. In the Savile case, there were victims that tried to report at the time were told, well, that's just Jimmy, what do you expect? Others felt threatened or intimidated. He said he had contacts in the police, which was true. So they wouldn't necessarily have the trust of the police to report. We kept the NSPCC helpline open, and one of the significant developments for them was they actually had to recruit 22 more staff to work on the helpline because of the massive increase in reporting. And there's some incredible data. If you look at the Office for National Statistics that provides the UK's data, they have a chart that shows the reporting of rape and other serious sex offences in the sort of 3 or 4 years before 2012, and it's more or less flat. You then see an exponential rise and they draw a line, and it's not us putting the line, it's government saying this is Operation Yewtree. We described it as a watershed moment.
The Yewtree effect, I
yes.
think. Yeah.
And the Yewtree effect actually worked against us at times because so many people were coming forward. A bit like the Me Too movement, which followed some years later, coming out of the
Weinstein,
US.
Yeah.
And that it's so interesting, the culture of disbelief and denial that follows some of these things. People don't want to hear it. It's unpleasant. You don't want to feel that they've been had over or they've misjudged something, and they talk about people jumping on the bandwagon. So actually other defendants would say, oh, well, this has only come to court because of the Yewtree effect. There were big debates about the pendulum having swung too far, but actually we had 100% conviction rate for those that we put forward. Now, we only put forward the strongest cases.
Yeah, I mean, that was that's something I was going to ask, which is, you've got this context where there are allegations coming in thick and fast. I wonder how you go about assessing, how did you go about assessing them, and which ones met this threshold, and what you did with the ones that didn't meet that threshold, and how did you use technology at that point, or how did that work out?
Well, one of the real challenges with non-recent abuse investigations is time, and the fact that people's memories are imperfect. But also we were looking at crimes that had been committed in the 70s and 80s. We don't have a statute of limitations in the UK, but interestingly enough, I was interviewed earlier this year by 2 different Japanese television companies who have a very similar case that's broken in Japan, where a very high-profile figure has died. Reports of abuse that he perpetrated have come out, and their police haven't been taking action, in part because they say, well, there can't be a criminal justice outcome. That's correct, but there can be a social justice outcome. And the really important thing for the victims of abuse is that they are actually made to feel like that they are being believed, they are being taken seriously, that actually the information is now being recorded, that it wasn't their fault. That they didn't do something that led him on or caused this abuse to take place, and that actually they're being listened to and they get access to therapeutic care. So the investigators are going to have to meet with all of them. Firstly, we're going to have to record the information. That's the important thing, getting it in the system. And then we built the cases around those where you've got completely unconnected victims but reporting about the same person who's following the same pattern of behaviour and abusing them in very similar situations. Often you'll find that they have told somebody else, so we will go and get statements from those people as well and try and corroborate as best we can. Now, one of the challenges with investigations, and you go back to the early days of CID training, we were taught the ABC, which is accept nothing, believe no one, and confirm or corroborate everything.
Yeah.
The real difficulty is with investigating sex offences. If you make people feel that they're not being believed, they will walk away very quickly. And you have to handle those types of cases very differently to perhaps property crime or fraud.
We deal, or I have conversations with lots of organisations that have a similar concept. And frankly, with law enforcement, often one is taught to find the bad person, man or woman. That's your priority. That's what you need to do. And sometimes that's can be at the expense of the victim. And we see that time and time again. So I come into contact with a real contrast between law enforcement, and it is nuanced. So I'm giving a little bit of a sort of extremes, but as compared to social care people who are person centric. So, for example, they come into it thinking about the person in front of them, the victim. And what's the care plan? How do we care for this person? And that's the more important thing. And if during that conversation you can start to glean some information in terms of the perpetrator of those things, then great. But that's kind of almost like that's a benefit of this process. Did you come into contact with that sort of contrast in what you did?
Absolutely. These types of inquiries have to be victim-centric. They have to be victim-focused. And we were the lead news story with Yewtree for 14 days in 2012. The only other lead news story in 2012 that lasted that long was the Olympics. We don't talk about that anymore particularly, but Yewtree, Savile, and the other people, the pop star Gary Glitter, the entertainer Rolf Harris, these cases are still mentioned. Documentaries are still being produced on those, and there's some incredibly important learning in those about how do you firstly convince the victims, survivors of that abuse, to report, to share what's happened to them. These are really difficult things for them to talk about. They may not have told their partners or their family, and then all of a sudden to revisit that can do enormous harm. So at the same time as supporting them through the court process, because in our criminal justice system it operates on the principle of beyond all reasonable doubt. It's an incredibly high bar to set. It's an adversarial system, unlike the European sort of inquisitorial system. So we've got to present a very strong case to the courts for a jury to decide on a person's guilt. And we need those victims. We talk about policing by consent. Public confidence is so important. But it's not just policing, it's the whole criminal justice system that they need to trust. But at the same time as making sure they get that support through the criminal justice system, there's a whole therapeutic side that needs to be really carefully managed so that their evidence, their recollection isn't tainted. And it's very easy for defence lawyers, and these powerful people will employ the top lawyers in the country to defend them. They will use every tactic possible to ensure their liberty isn't deprived. And when you're the victim standing there on your own in that witness box, it's really challenging, which is why the detectives have to be so careful about how they build their cases, how the lawyers present the information, how you build that case to get over that threshold of beyond all reasonable doubt.
Yeah. So a quick final question on that before perhaps we reflect a bit on Yewtree in terms of what went well and what could have been improved. But I suppose my final question is back to this triage process, and you've identified all the cases that have a reasonable chance of prosecution. What was your process for dealing with the ones that didn't? Was it sort of handing over to a different sort of set of organisations to sort of continue their work, if you like?
No, that's a really important point. The Met and our sort of territorial framework is London and the 32 boroughs that make up London. That's the area we're responsible for policing. Have are sitting on this great big pile of information about national celebrities. And our police service is overseen and coordinated by a body called the National Police Chiefs Council. And in 2014, they realised that they needed to take this responsibility from the Met, and something called Operation Hydrant was created to, and again, using the home system. So this is the real importance of interoperable, compatible computer systems and data management and storage, that the Met can take its data and put it into a system managed by another force. In this instance, it was Norfolk Police. And that operation still manages today. And it's a clearinghouse of trying to draw these connections together, because the footprint of offenders like Savile is national. It's actually international. But no one, this is one of the issues from the 70s and 80s, no one police force had a clear picture of what he was doing, what the offending behaviour was. At the same time as the NPCC was setting up Hydrant, our government had created a public inquiry called the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, or ICSA, which is a quasi-judicial inquiry reporting to Parliament about this whole topic. There was, and it wasn't just Yewtree, but Yewtree was probably the catalyst for it, of recognising that there's this significant problem, this underreporting of offences. There are issues in the past that have not been addressed properly. That inquiry reported only in the last sort of 18 months, but Hydrant was the link to that, because survivors and victims were going forward with more information. And you only need investigative journalists to, let's say, look at army cadets or air cadets. A Panorama, on one of our BBC evening news programmes, did an investigative piece around the cadet services in the military, and all of a sudden many more victims come forward and say, yep, that happened to me too. And this is a whole issue about empowerment of survivors, making them recognise they're not alone. It wasn't just them, and this was a pattern of behaviour by the predators, by the offenders. And all of that information we have to back record convert into our systems. The leopard doesn't change its spots. And the sexual predator is very devious in the way that they operate, and will spend, we could spend ages talking about grooming and the processes, but so much of that has been taken online now. What was having to be done face to face, nurturing, wheedling away into organisations, institutions, churches, youth groups, families, getting alongside them, now can be done so much more quickly in social media.
And I think we'll definitely go into some of that. I think, and it also links to perhaps the question that I've got now, which is around things that perhaps you're proud of from Yewtree. There's a legacy, obviously, in terms of the Yewtree effect, and or certainly the societal change, but also what were some of the so what were you proud of as part of Yewtree, and what perhaps could have been done better? I've only got the benefit of 10 years of hindsight.
And trust me, I look back at it. It's one of those things that and this wasn't about me, this was about the team. It was about the way we collectively approached it, the way the investigators dealt with the victims. But I said the one thing for me is that significant uplift in reporting, and it's been sustained in the sense that there's been no drop off. We have changed the way we investigate non-recent abuse. The Director of Public Prosecutions at the time, our chief prosecutor, was Sir Keir Starmer. And I remember walking into my boss's office at the time. My assistant commissioner was Mark Rowley, now Sir Mark Rowley, Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. And he was in the middle of a conversation with Keir Starmer. I suddenly realised how unstrategic I was. I was too busy looking down, fighting the fires, but I was listening to their conversation about how do we make sure this never happens again. And as Director of Public Prosecution, Keir Starmer changed the approach of our Crown Prosecution Service to their attitudes. He realised that they were applying the same credibility test for the cases in deciding what they take to court as the predator was applying to the victims. They were looking at the credibility of the witness. And of course, and this was put to me by one of the survivors, that people like Savile prey on the uncredibles, the people that won't be believed. They're always the troubled ones. And when you see high-profile figures being prosecuted, they'll often wheel in all sorts of other high-profile people to say, well, he's an absolute gentleman. He'd never treat me like that. Of course, he's not going to do that to people like you. He's going to be looking for the vulnerable. People like Weinstein induce vulnerability. They create the situations where they can get the sexual gratification that they're seeking. But I think, if you say that the one thing, that it's that increasing reporting, so the information is actually getting in there. And even if you don't get a prosecution, you've still got the intelligence. So when we come to do our vetting to make sure that only the right people are getting to work with in the most vulnerable, whether it's in youth groups, hospitals, that intelligence is in the system, and you can take better informed judgments. You can manage risk better. You can identify risk if you've got the information.
Yeah, great. That's a great little anecdote in terms of that story, because that is a perception change that is as a result of the work you did. So that's something to be really proud of. And then on to some of the improvements, perhaps.
Well, we certainly improved the way that we investigate those types of cases. I think Operation Hydrant, this is one of the challenges we're still having 43 separate police forces, has provided that coordinating approach. There's better partnership working. Anybody working in a safeguarding public protection type role has to work in partnership with other services. So, and it's not just the statutory services, it's charities like NSPCC. We also worked with the National Association for People Abused in Childhood, Rape Crisis, Women's Aid. They all have helplines. They all have information that's absolutely vital for not just law enforcement, but for other organisations that are trying to make their institutions safe places for the vulnerable.
So you think another sort of outcome has been a more cohesive ecosystem when this thing happens, from the non-profit to the social care to the law enforcement, that sort of whole care, if you like.
Undoubtedly. And, one of the challenges at the moment is the funding for our statutory sector. The thresholds for investigation by social services and indeed police have gone up. I'm going to work very closely with charities now who are holding on to cases for far longer than they ever used to, because there just isn't the capacity within the statutory sector to take action and have those sort of early interventions. There have also been a number of debriefs around cases like Savile. With the Savile case, NSPCC actually got some of the victims in to find out what are the barriers to reporting. What's stopping you from telling us about these sorts of crimes earlier. But it's also really important to have a look at the other serious case reviews that are done around instances of abuse within schools or the faith sector. And one of the key bits of learning is about having early intervention policies, having a mechanism in place that people feel that they can speak up, that they can challenge, and that it's recorded. Taken seriously. And actually it may just be an error of judgment on that person's part, and they just need a gentle word of advice that was unsafe practice. You can't do that sort of thing. You're just demonstrating that you have got a very strong safeguarding framework in place.
I've certainly seen a significant increase in organisations' front-end reporting capabilities and the culture to support that. which is really encouraging. I guess part of it is I'm now thinking about the impact of the investigation of Yewtree, and we've talked a lot about the reporting. We've talked about the survivors and the victims and how we can better support them, both in terms of them reporting and then the aftercare. So there's been an impact on that. What about the impact on the nation of Yewtree? What do you reflect in terms of what we've learned as citizens following that case?
There've been a number of TV programmes that have tried to look at this either from a documentary perspective. So Netflix had a phenomenal two-part programme all around Savile. How did he get to do it? The BBC put together...
It was harrowing.
Yeah. Well, the BBC put together a drama recently with Steve Coogan. Again, you can actually challenge the wisdom of doing that, but actually what they are trying to do is just show how people can get away with things like this in our society. How is it that we create an environment where they feel that they're free to abuse whoever they want? That, and this is about power and vulnerability, and that collision between power with vulnerability. Ideally, people in powerful positions should be able to support the vulnerable, help them through their lives, whether it's children or adults who are at risk of harm. But when you've got powerful people wanting to abuse that and abuse the individuals for their own sexual gratification, it does enormous harm. And when you look back, and I would say the Netflix, it was something like A Very British Crime, or a Very British Horror Story, I think it was. It's one of the most watched Netflix documentaries ever. But when you see the things that he was doing, and there's actually a book called Hiding in Plain Sight, and that's one of the phrases that was used around him a lot. It was clear and visible for everyone to see. Yet, how did he get away with it? Now, I would like to think in 2024, with the advent of social media, where people are putting information out so much more quickly and challenging that sort of behaviour or stating what's happened to them, that there is less of a chance of people getting away with it for quite so long. There may be an intervention much earlier, and that early intervention is so important.
I think just reflecting on my experience of that, you kind of think, right, this is this whole hiding in plain sight. I don't. Am I right in saying that the "He Groomed Our Nation" is attributable to you? Is that right?
Yeah. What I couldn't quite get my head round at the time that the story broke was that a massive amount of media interest, but they all wanted to blame the BBC. They're saying this is the BBC's fault. Well, when I first met with the BBC's lawyers in sort of the first week of the investigation, I asked them for their safeguarding policies from the 70s and 80s so that we could have a look and see how effective they were. And the BBC lawyer looked a bit blankly at me, and I said, "Don't worry, I'm only joking. We didn't invent the concept of safeguarding until 1998, when the government produced a document called Working Together to Safeguard Children. The BBC would not have seen it as its responsibility to safeguard young people in the organisation in the 70s and 80s. That was down to parents or whoever. And all the organisations would have been the same. But our media was absolutely hell-bent on trying to hang the BBC out to dry for Savile. Now, there is some culpability. There has been a massive review. They didn't handle the information around him and others as effectively as they would, but probably not any different to any other big institution. When I was asked in our final press conference, and we were releasing a document at the time that we'd put together with NSPCC called Giving Victims a Voice. It's available on the internet. It's got all the data, all of the learning from the work around Savile himself, not necessarily the other cases. But one of the journalists said to me, "So who's to blame?" And I remember the response, because it's not actually written down anywhere. It's not in a press release or anything. But I remember saying, look, there's one person who's responsible for this abuse. who took in everybody in this country, from royalty to politicians to the public, to hospitals, prisons. His footprint, all that. We were all taken in by him. We were all fooled by him. And I just said, it's almost a throwaway remark, you could say he groomed the nation. And that, that actually gets debated on Mumsnet and in universities as a concept. Am I laying off blame too easily on someone else? But actually, that's what's happened. We were all groomed by him. Louis Theroux, in one of his television programs, is actually asked by one of the victims who he visits as to was he groomed by Savile? And Theroux says, no, he didn't abuse me, but I was beguiled by him, a typical Theroux word. But actually, he was groomed. You don't have to be the victim of abuse to be groomed. Paedophiles will groom the parents, will be grooming organisations, and it's all about putting on this persona of something that they're not.
Yeah, because I remember it, and I remember thinking, God, my granddad used to work in a factory, and I remember Jim fixed it for, it was a chocolate factory, fixed it for a child to visit that chocolate factory, and there's a picture of my granddad with Jimmy Savile and a load of children. You say, oh God, well, and then it gets closer to home. I remember a case, I won't mention the organisation, but this person hiding in plain sight, big character, subsequently found guilty of child abuse. Because of, he was larger than life. He was the person you go, oh no, he's just a bit. I think as a nation, we learned that lesson. But I think the worrying thing for me, and I think we'll probably come on to this, but the worrying thing for me is criminal nature is criminals, paedophiles, will be very effective at finding vulnerabilities. So it seems like we've gone some distance, but by no means claim it as a victory in terms of putting measures in place to make it not right for people in organisations, particularly those hiding in plain sight, to get away with this. But of course, what these individuals may now be doing is migrating into a different space. Obviously, online is the low hanging fruit in terms of risk and ability to abuse, which we'll come on to. So that's all. That's an interesting perspective. The final perspective in terms of the impact I wanted to touch on is the impact on people on the front line, the impact on you, for example, of a career with a reasonable focus around child abuse and all of those in the wider sector, not just within policing, who are dealing with the effects of dealing with and managing this kind of stuff. And just to give a quick example, I was in the Hague just before Christmas, speaking to an organisation that do have a global operation and safeguard young children in some of the most difficult territories in the world. And I was chatting to a safeguarding manager who it was a dinner. It was we'd gone out for a team dinner, and she got quite upset, and she basically sort of let me know that she was planning on leaving the profession. She was relatively young, but she just said, just the difficulty I have in dealing with some of the worst in society, it affects me deeply. And at this point she was in tears, and that's really stuck with me, and it's made me think, well, how do you deal with that? How do you reflect on that? What would be your advice in that scenario?
It's incredibly difficult, and really sorry to hear about the effect it's having on that person. As I said to you earlier, this whole world of sort of safeguarding, child protection, you never leave it. Once you've been exposed to the harm that's being caused to the most vulnerable in our society, you feel you have to do something about it. And you see so many of my former colleagues now in safeguarding officer roles in various organisations, still trying to fight the cause, as it were. When I started in 2002, back in the Met in the Child Abuse Investigation Command, our police authority, as it was then, decided that all of the officers would have mandatory counselling every 6 months. A company was brought in to provide that support, and our HR department tracked to make sure that they actually had the opportunity to share any concerns that they've got. And we had one particular team of actually police staff, so civilians, who spent all their time as part of the paedophile unit viewing seized material. Now, we have tried to digitise that process, and this is one of the big bits of learning from Operation Cathedral and the Wonderland Club around hash values on images, so trying to get the digital fingerprint, if you like, of an image. So when you're trying to identify from seized material if there are any new images, because if that image has only appeared from that particular suspect and it's never made its way out, then there is a child somewhere very near to that suspect who is the victim of abuse. And you've got to try and sort of filter out, and this is where I'm incredibly nervous around AI and the way those images are being created. That it's just adding so much more of a problem of actually trying to get to where are the victims, who is at risk. But it needs strong leadership. It needs organisations to be taking care of their safeguarding officers or their investigators and making sure that they're properly supported, rotated if necessary, not forcing people into roles that they're not equipped to do. Many people, I don't know the exact statistic, but many people, women in particular, will have suffered some sort of abuse in their life. That was one of the things with Yewtree. It became a dinner party conversation at many tables across Britain where people were talking in that, they're just jumping on the bandwagon, or that's how life was then. But actually it got people talking and thinking about it. No, it wasn't acceptable, and it was a crime, and it shouldn't happen. And it, and that hurt stays with them for the rest of their lives.
And what would you say if we've got some listeners who are, and there will be, who are dealing with this kind of thing, on a day-to-day basis? Would you give, what piece of advice might you give to them if they're sort of, in that situation that I alluded to, struggling a bit with what's going on and the content of what they're doing and the psychological impact of this? What would be how would you approach that?
I think the most important thing is to talk about it. Tell someone that you trust. If you need to get some more professional support, but don't bottle it up. Don't store it away, because it will burst out at some point. There's a cumulative effect of all of this information that you're processing, starting to take its toll on you, and you'll become less effective at supporting the people, the very vulnerable that you want to help and you want to work with, if you yourself fall over. So don't hold on to it. Talk to someone close to you, talk to a line manager, occupational health department if you have one. The organisations have a duty of care for their staff if they're exposing them to these sorts of things and that risk, and people will cope with it in different ways. Having been brought up in a medical family, as I said right at the beginning, these sorts of conversations at home were quite normal. And when you're dealing with murder, rape and child abuse and the images that you see, you become a bit immune to it. That's probably not a good thing. You can become desensitized, but that's a way of handling it. But not everybody is made the same way. And one of the other things I've become aware of is how in later life, the things that you've been able to process and deal with when you were younger, all of a sudden, when something else happens, such as a divorce, a bereavement, a business failure, all of the other things start to surface. And this is one of the issues for survivors of abuse who report much later in life. They go back to that time as a life-changing moment, and that they need to get that resolved. And it doesn't matter if it's 10 years, 20 years or 30 years on, the criminal needs to know that someone is going to deal with it and come for them.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Thanks for that reflection. So I think now we'll turn into the sort of the final sort of part of the conversation where we think about the future. As I say, we put ourselves into 2030 and we start to think about what does this world look like? What are the threats and how can we combat them? Do you want to sort of kick off with a few thoughts?
It's incredibly difficult because the pace of change is so fast. I've dabbled with AI and seen the power and the potential of it. And I do start to wonder how we upskill our investigators or our safeguarding professionals to use these sorts of tools effectively. Everything that they need to be aware of, the predator is already using. And whilst law enforcement in particular will have to wait for legislation to catch up and assist them, and they're still operating in quite traditional ways, the perpetrators of abuse and offence are light years ahead of them. At the moment, we've got a debate in the UK around children's use of smartphones. Talk about banning use of a smartphone under the age of 16. Who knows what social media is going to look like in 10 years' time?
It terrifies me. Can I take a moment just to explain? I'm a father of two. I've got a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old, and I have the unfortunate sort of situation where I see what's happening in technology and it sort of scares me a bit, particularly, so I would characterize it and it's not dissimilar to other crimes, but historically pedophiles would abuse in a physical setting, right? You find the vulnerable people and you apply traditional techniques to abuse them. That's a known thing, and it obviously happens even today, and it's terrifying. Then what's happened over the last 20 years is social media and digitization and etc. has put a layer over that, which basically makes that whole process a lot easier and less risky for a paedophile because they're doing it online, not in person. And then we're seeing all this grooming that's going on online, which is in itself a concern. And the thing that's concerning about it is the volume of opportunities that paedophiles will have to abuse. In a physical setting, it's a finite number of individuals you can go after, right? In online, it's when you go online, it broadens. But the thing that's scary about AI is that it can infinitely increase the volume of vulnerable people that you go after. So in terms of deepfakes and that's here now, right? But you can picture the quality of that improving exponentially, so that en masse, a single person could be grooming millions of people, and really all you need then is 1 in 1,000 to whatever that statistic is. So what AI is going to do, even more so than it's doing today, which is the thing that scares me, is triage huge volumes of vulnerable people, making the risk of paedophiles being able to commit crime much higher, and that terrifies me.
The more I think about this, the more terrified I become. Now, your children have the benefit of you as a father who understands this, who gets it. But many, many parents around the country do not have your level of understanding of what their children are doing in the bedroom, on the Xbox, on the smartphone, locked away in the darkness of the room, under the bed covers, wherever they are, where the parents cannot see and actually don't understand the technologies their children are using. The fact that you have that level of knowledge, but how do we get that out to all of the other parents? How do we educate parents and teachers and other carers and professionals who are interacting with those children? Because the children will learn this stuff way quicker than the adults will. technology is undoubtedly enabling crime. We're using language sort of sextortion or self-generated images, things we never had to think about before. But actually, you were talking there about paedophiles. And when I started in child abuse investigations, we used the statistic of 95% is parent-carer professional of the abuse. However, what we're seeing now is about 50% of abuse is peer-on-peer. So young people are getting access through their devices to material that you and I would never have seen as children. And when you've got on the sort of social media influencers, people like Andrew Tate, this whole issue around misogyny, entitlement, what's the role of women in society, how do men are supposed to behave and act, who are the role models for these young men. And I was reading an article in one of our evening papers in London, the Evening Standard, only this week, where they've gone to schools, 4-page article. It's well worth looking at. 2 pages on boys' attitudes, on things like the rating of girls, slut shaming, getting images. But if you release an image of yourself and you put it on a WhatsApp or Snapchat, is what they were talking about, but you have created a paedophilic image if you are under the age of 18. And all of those people are now in possession of it. These self-generated images, they are all committing a criminal offence, having that image, but they're sharing it. But that some of these images are going to be artificially generated, and it's going to be incredibly difficult for those vulnerable individuals to deal with. But we're normalising behaviour, desensitising people, where young men are looking at images where it seems appropriate to choke women when they're having sex with them. The boys don't know what the right sort of behaviour is, and the girls don't know what a healthy sexual relationship is, because they think they've got to act out the roles that they're seeing on the internet. It's being used as some induction to gangs and groups, where that you have to behave in this way. So there's incredible threats and challenges out there. And it's not just in the sort of criminal context, it's the social context, and it's a whole society problem. It's not going to be solved by law enforcement. This isn't a locking people up issue.
It will take everyone, a whole system to solve. But the people who are going to really help move the needle are the tech firms. Right. So I was watching an interview with the OpenAI CEO, Sam Altman. And it wasn't anything to do with safeguarding or online abuse or anything like that. It was just him talking about the future of AI, and I just sat there and thought, he and probably a smallish number of individuals are going to be the people who are going to really help move the needle in the right direction here. It's these algorithms that are not just created with the objective of profit, but created with the objective of reducing harm. And I don't just mean stopping harm, I mean reducing harm. So these people, you look in their eyes and you think, right, are you going to, as part of your mission in life, are you going to make these tools? Because of course, as a technologist and optimist, I see the huge benefit that we're going to get from AI, the productivity improvements, everything like that. There's a huge positive, but these people have to be equally cognizant of the risk. And do you know what? The technologies will be able to do this. Build out those algorithms, those technologies that spot harm. We talk about spotting harm earlier in a harm life cycle, right? That's standard practice now when we think about investigating and we think about intelligence and all those things. I don't know whether it's standard practice in technology to go, right, okay, that's a bit concerning. I've got the capability to interpret this scenario that's unfolding. That's a bit concerning. We need to address that. So I think that the technology firms have an outsized responsibility here to do something.
And we've got to prick their social confidence. You've got to get them to recognise that they are part of the solution. It really struggled around encryption, though, and you look at the sort of debates in the last few years around law enforcement being able to access encrypted material, trying to get the organisations to recognise that they are carrying this information, and not necessarily just around child abuse material, but it could be around suicidal ideation, actually advising people on how to end their lives, and if you're a vulnerable young person at a particular low point, having that sort of material readily available is harmful.
But I mean, you could equally get when we start talking early lower level concern, early intervention, we start moving away from law enforcement and police responses, because where this is these platforms working with parents and caregivers and the actual individual, the actual person that is that may or may not be vulnerable, and interacting with them and highlighting these things in a really sophisticated way, so that you can start, that's that sort of harm prevention angle, which I don't see.
Prevention is a key word in this, you talk about reducing risk. For me, it's actually minimising risk, or mitigating it. But we need to be proactive and we need to be preventative, and build in as many sort of measures to keep the stuff away from the vulnerable, allow them to grow, allow them to thrive without viewing this sort of material. But I say there is a massive challenge at the moment, and we're spotting it in the UK. I don't know what the data's like for the rest of the world, but the talk is now that 50% of child abuse is peer on peer, and it is just as harmful as having an older person abusing a young person. The harm is going to be with them forevermore. It's going to affect the way they lead their lives, the relationships that they build, the trust that they have in their fellow human beings. And the technology companies have to recognise they have a significant part to play. They can't behind freedom of speech type approach.
Just continuing the analogy, one of the things I reflected on is that an AI, call it that, could be our children's closest confidant going forward. Because let's just assume, I don't know, I'm picturing my son growing up, there are systems that are learning what, educationally what he's good and bad at. There's things understanding how he interacts online, his response to situations that are both negative and positive, and it's gaining probably a better understanding potentially than anyone else would have. So then when it comes to points in one's life, when one reaches I don't know, maybe it's a crisis point, maybe it's a decision point, it's like, I don't know what to do in my career. What do you think? And I said, well, based on my experience, I think you're strong at this and strong at that, and you're not particularly this and not particularly that. Well, why don't you do it? So you potentially will have AI that will be the closest confidant of the next generation of children. So if you're thinking in that context and you're designing stuff like that, you've really got to think about prevention from design, haven't you? Because one assumes on the optimistic side that technology like this, which has a deep interpretation of its environment, whether it's you or whether it's the context of something unfolding in an online conversation, or it's whatever, it's interpreting it. So that interpretation should logically be able to interpret risk and harm and things like that, and hopefully direct in a certain direction.
And I think every technology company should have a safeguarding strategy, and they should be having a risk assessment that looks at all of the risks from the technology from a safeguarding perspective, and then a plan to mitigate those risks in the design before they put a product out to market. I'm unfortunately not as optimistic as you are. I love to hear your optimism, and the fact that as a parent you're thinking about these things, you're in the industry, you can help shape the thinking. I'm outside of that world, but and I can't pretend to understand it or get my head around it. I'm very nervous about the future, because I know that every new technology gets exploited, and the danger is, and that tipping point is where the harm that the technology does outstrips the good. and then we have to
Yeah.
have a real hard
Which
look
is
at
why
it.
it comes back to looking in the eyes of the people. And it isn't me, by the way, obviously, but this is looking in the eyes of the people who are developing hands-on that next technology, the Sam Altmans of this world. They're the people, and this is the slightly concerning thing, that it's not British law enforcement, it's not UK government, it's not it's in the hands seemingly of a relatively small number of organisations that are currently developing that next generation of technology. That's just mind-boggling, really. So yeah. Anyway, the reflections as they are. And any other reflections before we perhaps go on to finishing?
I've been hugely privileged to be involved in this world. I'm still in contact with some of the victims from the Savile case. They don't actually understand the full impact of their speaking out around what happened to them and what changes that have followed since then. When you look at the tragic murder of Sarah Everard in the UK a couple of years ago now, the Everyone's Invited movement that started with online reporting of what's happening in our schools around cultural entitlement, the misogyny, the sexism, these are all warning signs, alarm bells, but these all follow a sequence, of behaviours where the problem hasn't gone away. We have to be relentless in our focus and pursuit of those who cause harm to others in our society if we want to carry on as a civilised human race. And to be part of that, I'm still in that world, working mainly in the faith and charity context, as you say, and it's daily interaction with people, talking to people, capturing the information, and then using technology to its best effect to make everything that we do more efficient and more effective.
Very well said, Peter. Thank you very much. And just leaves me to say thank you very much for coming here. It's been a privilege to have this conversation. I've learnt a lot, and thank you very much.
And thank you for what you do. And please, as a parent, as a technologist, go and advocate, get those people together. There's Clue can do this. You've got the brand, you've got the connections, but actually you can raise the awareness that many of the people in your sector may not have. They haven't been exposed to the things that you and your colleagues are looking at.
Yeah,
so
thank you.
Good luck with the work.
Yeah, thank you very much. Really appreciate that, Peter. Thanks. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Joining the Dots with me, Thomas Drowan. We hope you found today's conversation practical and insightful. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review on your favourite podcast platform. It really helps us reach more listeners like you. Stay tuned for more episodes where we continue to uncover the stories of those on the front line of justice, harm reduction and global security. This is Thomas Drowan, signing off. Thanks for listening.